Welcome you
Good
all
afternoon,
in the
sir.
first welcome you all in the first technical session of this 1 week adult faculty development program organized by Department of Tourism and Hospitality Management, Mizoram University. Respected speaker of this technical session first, Dr. Neel Kamal Champion, Head of the Department, Dr. Himanshu Bhushan Rao, other faculty members of the department, and dear participants participating in this faculty development program. Welcome you all in this first technical session. Before inviting our speaker of this session, I would like to give a brief introduction of Dr. Neel Kamal Champion, our respected speaker of this session. Dr. Neel Kamal Champion obtained his PhD from University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, USA, where his dissertation focused on rethinking cultural heritage conservation at traditional settlements. He also has an architecture doctorate and graduate certificate in historic preservation from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, USA. A professional conservation course at ICCROM in Italy, and Bachelor of Architecture from Institute of Engineering, Tribhuvan University, Nepal. Prior to joining Ahmedabad University, Dr. Neel Kamal Champion was working as a full-time faculty at University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, USA, and as a doctoral teaching assistant at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, USA. Dr. Neel Kamal Champion joined Center for Heritage Management, Ahmedabad University, Ahmedabad in the year 2013. He was promoted as a director, Center for Heritage Management in the university in 2017 and leading the center since then. He has been the conference chair for the series of international conferences on heritage management, education and practices at Ahmedabad University. Dr. Champion has co-edited a book titled Asian Heritage Management, Context, Concerns, and Prospects, which was published by the world's top publisher, Routledge, in the year 2013. Dr. Champion is also coordinating a publication series from Nepal titled Reflections on the Built Environment and Associated Practices, of which the first volume was published in the year 2013, the second volume in 2016, and the third volume in 2019. Dr. Neel Kamal Champion serves on the member editorial board in the Journal of Heritage Management, a reputed journal. He also serves as the bureau member in the Asia Pacific Higher Education Network for Intangible Cultural Heritage, as well as an executive committee member in the Asian Academy for Heritage Management, AAHM. He has been elected to the executive board of the Association for Critical Heritage Studies. Dr. Neel Kamal Champion has been a visiting fellow at UNESCO Category 2 Center on World Natural Heritage Management and Training at the Wildlife Institute of India, Dehradun. He is a fellow at the West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii, and advisor to the Master of Science and in Heritage Management at Wildlife Institute of India. So, on behalf of department and on my behalf, I, Dr. Pankaj Kumar, Assistant Professor in the Department of Tourism and Hospitality Management, would like to request Dr. Neel Kamal Champion for his talk on overview of heritage concept and challenges in global context. So, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Pankaj. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Himanshu, for the invitation. I have been here since the beginning, so it was wonderful to hear our distinguished guests, the keynote speaker, the guest of honor, as well as the Vice Chancellor of Mizoram University, all of whom spoke very eloquently about the heritage in India, the needs, and also the possibilities and all that. I have a presentation that I have prepared, but since I think we already lost almost half an hour, I would like to keep it short. But listening to the inaugural function, a few thoughts came to my mind. Let me begin with that. And I hope that will be useful since it is a faculty development program. At the outset, since this is organized by the Mizoram University as a faculty development program, I think it makes sense for me to also share a few words about our own center, the Center for Heritage Management at Ahmedabad University. My colleague, Dr. Yanis Paulis, also is in the room. He will be taking another session in the program. So reflecting on what the keynote speaker and the guest of honor also were highlighting, the need in India, there are two aspects to it. One is to recognize the diverse and rich heritage in India. And I don't need to elaborate this. This has already been elaborated. But as an academic, what I see as a challenge is how do we prepare the manpower? How do you prepare the next generation of professionals who can work on these rich heritage resources, not just from an architectural conservation point of view, but from multiple disciplinary point of view? I think that is an immense challenge that the academic institutions of India needs to take on. There are few institutes, Mizoram University now also taking interest in setting up its own department and several centers. As the Vice Chancellor said, it's a wonderful thing to hear. But I think many other universities also need to come forward. And therefore, we as one university, how can we contribute? So the thought from the Ahmedabad University, which was a new university set up just in 2019, was that a unique center was established in 2011. And one of the mandate given to the center was to design and launch a unique multidisciplinary program on heritage management. Now, I'm sharing that because in the room, I also see some students from Ahmedabad University who are pursuing a master's degree in heritage management. Now, this master's degree we have conceptualized as a way to bring in multiple expertise into the heritage sector. You have people from history background, the historians there, architects there, archaeologists, geographers, even engineers are there. And so I think this is something we have taken up. I just wanted to share this, thinking that probably colleagues at Mizoram University will also find it useful, and perhaps we can think about working together in future for this common cause. The second part is, as the previous speakers also highlighted, the heritage concept, heritage discourses in India need not necessarily be guided by UNESCO or anybody else from outside. India needs to have its own heritage discourse. India needs to have its own way of managing its heritage. And India has done it. It's not that it's not there. India has already done it for the centuries, for thousands of years. It has already done it. Therefore, we still have those heritage legacies present to us. The challenge today, however, is because of various factors, global, local, our own aspirations, the economic dynamics and all that, knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or unconsciously, we have also been losing our heritage. We have not been paying due respect to our heritage. We have not been doing justice to the opportunities that the heritage sector brings. And therefore, I think there is a need for today for the academic institutions to come forward with this kind of program, not just for the faculty, but also for the students, for the practicing professionals, for broader communities in the country. But while saying that, I would also like to emphasize that this is not just the problem in India. This is actually a global problem. Every country in the world is facing the same issue. And therefore, it needs to be also thought in a very transnational way. And while saying that, I must also recognize that Dr. Yanis Paulis in our center, who is present here, he is from Greece, a country where much of heritage lessons can be learned. And I personally, I come from Nepal. I'm speaking to you from Nepal right now, from my home. So I think there is also an opportunity of regional collaboration, regional discourse to be framed and promoted, because heritage doesn't stop at the political boundaries. Heritage is shared. And I think that's another thing we have to bring in. And therefore, although much has been said in the inaugural session, what I would like to do in my given time is to share with you a PowerPoint that I have put together. And to that, maybe take you through some questions that I hope will be helpful. And by doing that, I hope I will be able to contribute some basic concepts and practices about heritage to this gathering of the participants in this FDP. So the title I have given is Heritage Discourses and Challenges / Responsibilities, because I would not just like to mention challenges. I would also like to remind us of our own responsibilities. But let us begin with the heritage discourses. And as I have used the plural term discourses, you may want to keep in mind that heritage doesn't have a singular discourse. Heritage can be understood in multiple ways, and therefore it's discourses. And since it is discourses, it needs to be debated, it needs to be discussed. There cannot be one very rigid principle about heritage. This needs to be discussed, debated, and reformulated again and again. And this is how we make heritage relevant. The task given to me is to talk in the international perspective. So I'll mention a few international frameworks, including the World Heritage that was talked about in the previous session as well. And then I will come to some challenges and responsibilities. Here are just a few books that are available in the market. I have picked this to represent different approach, different viewpoints, and different sort of collection in all of these books. On the one hand, you have Romila Thapar's very thought-provoking book, Indian Cultures as Heritage. How do you connect to history and the past and see that as a living heritage? And on the other hand, you have David Lowenthal, a geographer, talking about the past is a foreign country. And this has been a very thought-provoking book in the international sector. And then on the bottom, you have various kinds of books from a very sort of historical narrative of architectural conservation to several cases, including several from Asia. John Stubbs from Volume put together. In the middle top, you have Uses of Heritage by Lords and Smith, very thought-provoking book, which I will also refer in my presentation. And the other one, The Contemporary Theory of Conservation, a very, sort of a new way of thinking that has come. To me, heritage is like an iceberg. Heritage is not everything that we have, but it's a selected things of that. When you think of an iceberg, like this picture reminds you, you will remember that this is just the tip of the iceberg that we are seeing. And what remains under the water is vast. And heritage actually is dependent on these vast resources that sometimes we do not see, sometimes we do not recognize. And these come from history, geography, landscapes, culture, architecture, settlements, planning, cities, nature, wildlife, objects, collections, and our festivals, crafts, and so many other things. So this is a reflection of our society, which has accumulated so much knowledge, so much evidence, so much achievements through generations. It is still happening. So it is not just about the past, it is very much about the present achievements. But out of this, a few things we recognize as heritage, and that's what we see at the surface. And this is something I would like to remind. But what is it that makes something as a heritage? And I would like to quote Lords and Smith to say that it's actually about values. When you see some values in something, you may recognize that as a heritage. So heritage is not a given thing. It's not something that will be given to us absolutely, objectively. It's something we create. We identify certain values. We see some values in something, and therefore that something becomes heritage. So whenever we think of heritage, I would like to suggest that we need to ask this question: what makes this as heritage? What is the reason behind calling something as heritage? Okay, so that question, when we ask, we recognize there is certain values that we have put behind that particular thing or a practice or a knowledge, and therefore it becomes heritage. If that is the case, then heritage field, heritage profession is all about values assessment and preserving those values and making sure that those values are capitalized to make sense, to benefit the society. If you think of tourism, that many speakers are already talking about, it's about identifying a heritage, meaning that when you try to think of heritage tourism, you actually essentially identify what's the value proposition here and how do you step onto that value to promote some economic activities. That's what heritage tourism is all about. And there are several other business models that can also be thought of, right? So a few questions for us to think is in three areas. One is related to history. And what do we know from history? Earlier speaker also, I think in the keynote speech, there was a distinction made between history and heritage. I fully agree with that. And therefore, when you think of heritage, it's a way of making relation of current human society to the history. by asking these questions, how societies have used this relationship, and therefore the heritage things evolve. So it's about that identity, that ideas, and all that. There are also other so when we think of history, there are history as facts, but there are also evidence of history, which are called artifacts. And that's what you see in the museum. That's what you see in the archaeological sites. So that's one bit of heritage thinking. The second is driven by more of art history discourses, the principles of aesthetics, being unique, identifying something as the identifier. And there we can do some comparison, like something is unique, something is beautiful. Okay, so these are relative terms, but that also may give rise to some bit of heritage, which actually gives us a sense of belonging. It gives a sense of ownership to us, and also sometimes reminds us of our origin. So that's another set of heritage thinking, which comes from art history, aesthetic theory, and one I would say is more important for us to think about, which comes from sociological discourses, anthropological discourses, where what is development, what is modernization, what is nation building, what are nation states, all these very complicated questions about our society can actually lead to some kind of heritage thinking, and you'll find heritage discourse useful in this concept also. And I'm sure all the colleagues who are participating in this FDP, no matter what subject you teach, you will actually find heritage as an idea relevant in teaching your own subject, whether it's math or science or history, geography, anything, you name it, right? I would just like to step back to history now in the international perspective, how this idea came. And there are many steps to it. In the interest of time, I would just like to highlight a few things. I think in the modern international thinking about heritage, the arts and crafts movement, which particularly started from the United Kingdom in the 1800s, is a key, where as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, some people got concerned about people's knowledge, the hand skills, handicraft. Okay, and they wanted to ensure that in the rapid industrial development, when things are being mass produced, we do not lose sense of our handmade things. And so that laid rise to the arts and crafts movement in the UK, led by William Morris, later on John Ruskin associated with that, so several, which actually became a pan-European movement, also reached to Asia, particularly the East Asia, and I think some influence has happened in India as well. So we need to recognize that in the hardcore heritage sector, in the architectural heritage and conservation, the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings was an offshoot of this arts and craft movement, which came up with its own manifesto called the SPAB Manifesto. These sort of articulated some thoughts about the importance of old buildings, historic buildings, and that's how in the international arena, the architectural conservation became a mainstream thing before anything else. So on the one hand, you had arts and crafts movement looking at the craft sector, if you want to relate to India. And on the other hand, you had SPAB Manifesto, sort of protecting the ancient buildings. So craft and the architecture became two paramount areas that heritage sector really picked up in a historical sense. And therefore, there are a few leaders that we need to remember here. John Ruskin with the UK, and another I'd like to point here is the Eugène Viollet-le-Duc from France. He was a restorer. And as an academic, when you read about them, you look at their literature, you look at their activities, projects, and sometimes the debates between these two gentlemen, you will find that the idea of heritage, the idea of conservation, actually, in an international sense, evolved from these debates. Okay, so I do not have enough time to sort of deep dive into this debate, but I just wanted to point it out for you to take a note. So these you may want to look up. But for me, if I summarize, this is a working paper. I'm yet to publish this paper, but I have my own theory of how this idea evolved. And so I have this diagram that I would like to share with you, where on the one hand, I see some situations when we lose something, so there is a loss. When we see a threat to something that we feel very close to us, or when we recognize that, oh, something is very important because I see some value in it. So on the left hand side, you see these three bubbles, which represent three stages that we might be running at any given time. So if I apply this framework to historical narrative, I see the same thing happening. So when there is a sense of loss, it triggers nostalgia, it triggers memory, and you cherish them, right? And therefore, the end point is some kind of a memorials. And the right-hand side is what you see as the heritage, either as a heritage product or heritage as an action. Okay, so similarly from threats, it sort of triggers some kind of possession. We own it, and therefore we don't want to have the threat acting on it, and therefore we aim to protect it. Okay, and with the values, you feel proud about it. You see an identity associated with it, or you see some kind of a resource value there, and this leads you to think of how can you continue with the values, how can I retain the value there. And to me, these are this is the framework how I understand heritage, which not only allows me to understand heritage as a product, but also what we do when we recognize something as heritage. And therefore, if I apply it to the historical discourses, particularly in Europe, I see how the idea of restoration, idea of preservation, and in the 21st century, the idea of safeguarding has evolved in the international sense. And this is what you will find in the UNESCO's documents as well. So this is my theory of understanding how the evolution of heritage or conservation discourses has happened in the international sense. And again, I can connect this to this debate between John Ruskin in Viola too. And there are several other terminologies that one need to discuss, but I'm going to skip it for now. But what is important for us to recognize is, in my opinion, and this is just my argument, that there are two primary paradigms that we can see. On the one hand, there is this threat or protection paradigm, which is the preservation paradigm, which is, I call it as an old school thought of heritage. And there is a new paradigm, which is value-based, which is about well-being of the society, which is very much grounded on the sustainability paradigm. Okay, both of these paradigms have their own roles in the heritage thinking. They are still equally valid, but I'm trying to suggest that today more and more we are aligned to the value, well-being, and sustainability paradigm, which we can also consider as the living heritage paradigm. Okay, and these are some of the landmarks, some of the moments in history, the Industrial Revolution, or the First World War and the Second World War, or the peace movement, and all that. These are the contexts in which you will recognize these paradigms being very prominent. Okay, so the latest paradigm being the paradigm of sustainable development, the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and you will see that this is the new movement where diversity is emphasized, the creativity is emphasized. So I just wanted to sort of also capture the historical evolution of this idea in this framework. And therefore, if you look at it from this perspective, heritage is not just about monuments. Heritage is about so many other things, and these are just some of the things that I could think of. It could be natural, it could be cultural, ecological, intangible. It could be related to museums and objects and collections. It could be about festivals and traditions, arts and crafts, so many other things, right? So if that is the case, then what happens? Just a few examples I will draw here. Something that we are very much familiar with is the monuments conservation, monuments as heritage, right? But there also one need to recognize there are several approaches to monuments conservation. Either some does the preservation or conservation, restoration. These are some of the approaches that happens in monuments conservation, and each of these have some logic behind how do we understand values, how do we capture values, and how do we work with the values, right? And if you expand it to consider the site as a larger scale, then there are historic documents like Venice Charter, the ICOMOS that one of the earlier speaker also mentioned, the International Council on Monuments and Sites. They have come up with their own frameworks. It talks about settlements. One can look at urban heritage. Now there is a terminology called historic urban landscapes also. And if one comes from archaeology, you will see that archaeology, the core concept is about material culture, but today it has expanded to look at archaeology as a practice, so that it's not just looking at the material culture, but also it's how do we do archaeology, the community participation and all that. So every field that connects to heritage is expanding, it's evolving so rapidly that we need to keep our pace with that evolution of the discourses. And so if in archaeology you see some of the emerging practices are that there's an emphasis on underwater archaeology, there is a convention on that. There is a very useful use of aerial archaeology by using drones, by using aerial photographs, aerial surveys, but also using satellite imagery and all that. In the age of digital technology and internet, the ideas of digital archaeology and internet archaeology has taken shape, and this has become very popular. So one needs to recognize that these are new avenues of doing archaeology today, and therefore for heritage sector as well. And space archaeology, not just looking at to the earth from the space, but also looking at the space as an archaeological field is another domain that is really evolving. So these are some of the ways we can think of very traditional disciplines also really expanding into the idea of heritage in very interesting ways. And I think this is something I would like all of us to remember and see the potential of heritage in the future. Now, these are some of the international ways of looking at things. How does regional versions appear? And if you look at the United States, the North America particularly, they have advanced with the use of the terminology called cultural resource management. Okay, they don't go by architectural conservation, they use the word preservation, but then largely there is a drive to also use the word CRM, the cultural resource management. In Europe, archaeological heritage management has really taken good shape. In Australia, one sees cultural heritage management. I'm not saying that these other terms are not used in other parts, but I'm saying that if you look at the academic developments, you see, some of these continents have really taken up academic discourses on these areas very strongly. Of course, they are overlapping. They are not necessarily exclusive to each other, but these are some of the terminologies. Okay. Lately, from Europe, there is very inspirational work happening, particularly through the European Union and several universities, that cultural and creative industries as an idea, as a field of practice has really evolved. And I think this is something we must pay attention to this CCI, the Cultural and Creative Industries Discourse from Europe, which I think will be very relevant to India. And my colleague Yanis can also connect to that in his lecture later on. So in this context, what are some of the Indian concepts and practices, or what are some of the South Asian concepts? Because Indian concepts, Indians is not limited to just India as a country, but I think it's more of a South Asian discourse. And what are those? And this is where I'd like to mention this book, which was mentioned in my introduction. This is an old book. It was published in 2013, but I still see some value in the way we have framed this book. My colleague Kapila and I worked on this book. Obviously, I see a lot of revision of this book needed, but just briefly to share, what are the ways we can think of heritage in our continent? Obviously, there are certain contexts, and here in this book, we have looked at the Hindu philosophy, the Buddhist philosophy, and the Islamic philosophy to understand the notion of heritage. And there is some common themes across all these religious philosophies that we have in this continent, is that there is the notion of continuity. Now you look at Jain philosophy, you look at other philosophies that are in this subcontinent, you recognize that the continuity is a key that is happening. And the other things about the context that we have discussed in this book is the legal and institutional context. Like the keynote speaker also spoke about the Indian Constitution. That gives a framework. An Indian Constitution giving that framework, the mandate, the responsibility to the citizens themselves needs to be translated into the institutional mechanisms, which gives a context to managing heritage in India. Unless citizens of India really come forward, I think Indian heritage cannot be managed to its full potential. And therefore, one needs to understand the context, and the context can also be given by our cultural background, cultural traditions. Context can also be given by the very constitution of the country. Context can also be given by the academic institutions by really, imparting this awareness and responsibilities to our graduates, right? So one needs to look at the context that way. What context are we located in, and what context can we create for our heritage practice, right? And then obviously, then we have to also be aware of our concerns. What are our concerns? In India, if you look at the situation today, I think COVID-19 pandemic has also made us realize, it has exposed many of the weaknesses of our society, both legal and social. Okay, and I would say the economic disparity that exists in Indian society is a big concern. Okay, we talk about digital empowerment today. We talk about digital transactions, but then digital transactions, the tools and the literacy not being with a craft community in Rajasthan, that becomes a concern. So therefore, when you look at the concerns in the Indian heritage, one need to look at not only the social concerns, which I will also later on come as a challenge, but also look at some of the technological concerns, the legal concerns, but also some concerns related to our educational frameworks. So there are so many things that probably comes into concerns, but at the same time, we also need to see prospects. What are the prospects that we have? This gives us some rays of hope. And here in my book, my colleague Tara Sharma, writing from Ladakh in India, really had a very nice chapter on community-based approach, where she really highlighted how community actually has a very unique way of understanding their heritage. And if heritage professionals, if academics can capture that unique perspective from community, I think that's what India needs. And I think this is where a lot of the academic work can happen. And similarly, there are other prospects that one can also see. But I think in this continent, the culture, the diversity of cultures that we have, each culture has this notion of resilience that is really the hope. I think during the COVID-19 pandemic also we saw how communities came together and sort of worked on solving some problems. So I think heritage sector can also look at these as potential prospects, right? So some of the contexts that were derived from this book were the worldviews, natural context, cultural context, political context, also the local and the global discourses and the frameworks. And one thing that I discuss in my own introductory chapter in this book is I wanted to also put forward this idea that heritage needs to be understood in multiple levels, starting right at the individual. We as an individual, what heritage means to us. I think that is also very essential because that makes every citizen connected to the idea of heritage, because the heritage idea should not be thought of as a big idea that only relates to the government or the big organizations. As long as we break it down to the individuals, then only I think this idea makes sense. So this is something as an academic concept I would like to put forward, that we need to see these layers. So there is individual, there is family, there is community, and then gradually it goes to the national and international. And therefore, as discussed in the previous session, UNESCO and World Heritage are at one level. They're one kind of a community. And that need not be the only way to look at heritage. We need to think about our own national context, national interest. We need to look at our own small communities' interest and communities' pride, and what the community can do, how the community can benefit. But while saying that, we also need to think about every individual and see how they can connect to whatever we promote as heritage. And therefore, to me, this is how the different layers come. And therefore, accordingly, we can also think of the responses to heritage. How do we respond to these heritage? On the one hand, of course, monuments are there. We need to preserve and conserve those. But also we need to think of, as I said before, not just the monument is what you see, but what makes this infrastructure, this architecture as monuments is the values. And where are these values coming from? Who are the different stakeholders who connect to these values? And therefore, today we need to also think of safeguarding these values. How do we safeguard? How do we project? How do we promote? And when we do that, the very important is to ask ourselves, who defines the values? Who articulates the values? Who takes decisions? And why something has to be preserved? And how do we do it? And there I would like to suggest that it has to be driven as a process-centric approach. It's not necessarily about a particular heritage. It's about how do we work around that heritage. It has to be participatory. And eventually, I think both my colleague Yanis and myself, we believe in this living heritage approach. That's what we sort of advocate at the Center for Heritage Management at Ahmedabad University also. But this is a concept which has also been promoted by ECROM, an international capacity building agency, which is also an advisory body to the World Heritage Convention. And the living heritage approach is really, I think, fits well into the cultural context of this continent, where heritage is seen as a living entity. And therefore, the process has to be driven in a way that it is a win-win process. I'm sorry, I do not have enough time to describe all of this, but I'm just throwing it out. There are literatures available to it. You can look at it. But let me also just flag some of the concerns that I have when we put together this book. One of the concerns is the sort of divide between the idea of conservation or preservation and the idea of continuity. And I think we need to sometimes take decisions whether it's about continuity or it's about preserving at a certain state. And I think in Indian cases, except some monuments, most of the time heritage practice is about ensuring the continuity. It's about continuing the practice. There is also the dichotomy in the authorized heritage discourse. Authorized heritage discourse is a term that Lorgen and Smith uses in her book, where it's the official discourse, right? And I think what is needed in India is to also while the authorized heritage discourse, the official discourse, has its own values, we also need to have a people-led discourse, a community-based discourse. And when you look at heritage from the community-based discourse, you'll recognize that there is no separation between nature and culture. There is no separation between tangible and intangible. And this is something we have to also keep in mind. And this is one of my concerns, that unless we really break this dichotomy, I think our practice to heritage will be very limited. And that we need to be careful about. Notion of authenticity and values. Again, this goes back to UNESCO and the World Heritage and all that. And my argument is we don't need to necessarily stuck to those arguments. We can frame our own way of looking at our heritage. So that needs to be addressed. Identity policies, politics, crisis of critical thinking, disasters. These are something that we can discuss at length, but I am just putting it here. And the prospects, as I mentioned earlier, really the idea of living heritage is a prospect. Our traditional practices, institutions, the knowledge systems that we have, and our resilient cultures. These are the prospects. Now, even if you look at the nature conservation, it has also evolved from a very wild, wilderness-centric idea of nature to nature as a coexistence between human and nature, kind of an idea. So I think all of these discourses are evolving. All of these concepts are evolving, and we need to keep up with this. So to summarize, what I'm trying to suggest is heritage is not necessarily an objective idea that it's given, it's frozen. It's actually an idea that evolves according to the time, according to the societal needs. And therefore, I would like to again bring in Lorgen Smith here, who says that it's all about values. And therefore, to me, heritage is something that a society values and something that reflects what the society is all about. And so it can be tangible, it can be intangible, it can be reflected by very natural features, but it can be a mix of all of this as well. And therefore, heritage idea has its bearings in the past and history, but it doesn't necessarily stop there. It is very much about present, about our livelihood, about what we do as communities. And then for the academic interest, it connects through various disciplines and domains of our academic disciplines, but also of the everyday life. And therefore, it has a potential to shape our future in a sensitive and sustainable way. And therefore, it sort of also becomes an opportunity to act as a check and balance when there is a rapid development or rapid, infrastructural development, all that. Heritage can act as a check and balance also. So to me, heritage is an overarching idea. And then conservation is just one set of the interventions. And what is important is heritage is a noun. So heritage is product. There are heritage that we see and we enjoy, we work upon, but we also need to recognize that heritage is a verb, it's a practice. And by that, I mean that heritage is something we make. So we can constantly be making and remaking heritage. And therefore it's both noun and verb. And since most of you are faculty, you will understand and can connect to your own disciplines. And that leads to me to think that if it is all that, then it's subjective, it's about values. Then these are some of the critical questions I would put forward for us to think. What and when something becomes important and why it becomes important, and therefore it becomes heritage. What do we do when we see a value in something, and therefore it leads to the heritage practice frameworks? How do we react if that value seems to be compromised? And therefore it triggers certain laws, certain frameworks, certain mechanisms to protect those values. And then we also need to recognize that there might be different ways of perceiving these values. In other words, there might be different value systems. So how do we understand, how do we respond to these differences, and how do we understand values? So what are the heritage values? Obviously, there are historical values, archaeological values, architectural values, aesthetics values, symbolic values, cultural values, economic values, functional value, so many different kinds of values. And this is how it has evolved over time. And this allows us to really think of heritage as connected to various disciplines. And then there is this outstanding universal value, in short called OUV, which is a value which the World Heritage Convention uses to describe World Heritage properties. So if you are talking about World Heritage, this is all about OUV, and we need to understand that. And therefore, I would just like to mention here that World Heritage is just one discourse in these multiple discourses of heritage. So therefore, we should not think that World Heritage is the only way to talk about heritage. It is just one discourse promoted by UNESCO, which has its own operational guidelines, its own convention text, its own processes that I have listed here. The good thing about World Heritage Convention is recently it has come up with the category of cultural landscape, which really allows us to think of heritage in a very broad sense, where the entire landscape can be considered as heritage, where there might be monuments, there might be settlements, there might be just the forest or the river. So it's a mix of nature and culture, but also mix of tangible and intangible heritage. So that's something that came from World Heritage in the 90s, which is useful. And recently, the historical landscape is another term is introduced in the World Heritage mechanism, particularly in 2011, that will be useful in looking at the historic cities in India. So these are something that we can learn from the World Heritage sector. You can browse the websites. I'm not going to go into detail here. But I just want to take some, maybe 2 minutes to just mention that World Heritage also has a process. World Heritage will not be just listed out of the blue. For example, this past year from India, we have the Dholavira archaeological site listed in the World Heritage list. Now, how did that happen? So the process is every country, the member state of World Heritage Convention, has to first prepare a tentative list and submit to the World Heritage Committee. This tentative list already remains. So if you do not have anything in the tentative list today, you cannot think of nominating that into the World Heritage list. So the first thing is to nominate that into the tentative list. I think Varanasi is now in the tentative list. After the tentative list is there, then each country can prepare its own full nomination. And this is entirely up to the country, up to the member state to decide which site it wants to nominate. Okay, so India can decide whether it wants to nominate Dholavira or it wants to nominate something else, right? So when it decides, it has to prepare a full nomination dossier. It's a very intensive research, documentation, and a management plan preparation process, which all of it has to be submitted to the committee in a certain timeline. And this dossier will be reviewed by the advisory committee of the World Heritage Convention. I'd just like to have a small correction in something that was discussed in the previous session. Somewhere it was said that UNESCO created IUCN. It's not the case. IUCN is an independent entity, International Union for Conservation of Nature. It was created, established in 1948 when the UNESCO was also being created under UN system. These are independent institutions. But when the World Heritage Convention was formulated in 1972, both the IUCN and UNESCO actually came together to prepare this World Heritage Convention. So that's why in the World Heritage Convention, you have both the cultural sites and the natural sites. And as per the convention, while the UNESCO has the secretariat of the convention, it has 3 advisory bodies: ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites; IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature; and then ICRO, International Center for the Study of Conservation and Preservation of Cultural Property. These are the 3 advisory bodies. These bodies will be reviewing the dossiers that will be submitted to the World Heritage Convention. And after the dossier is reviewed, there will be inputs given, there will be feedback given, a lot of back and forth discussion. Of course, there are some political things also happen there. We don't need to go into that, but basically there is a process. And when finally the World Heritage Committee, which meets annually around June, July, when they approve, then only something gets listed in the World Heritage list. And therefore, World Heritage listing process is something that I would like you to keep in mind. And so this is how something gets listed in the World Heritage. But then it's not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of the journey, because that is actually a mandate to manage the World Heritage site, and the responsibilities to the respective country. And if the management is not done properly, if the outstanding universal value is compromised, then there is a chance that the property can be also proposed to be listed in something called the list of World Heritage Sites in danger. Okay, and these are the management mechanisms. I will not go into these details. This is something I would like to mention, that there are different ways of nominating something in the World Heritage list. And obviously it boils down to what values have you identified. And these values lead to identify at least one criteria out of the 10 criteria that the World Heritage Convention has. And depending on which criteria are you using, your site might be a cultural site or a natural site, or it can be a cultural landscape site, or it can also be a mixed site. So there are multiple ways. So the World Heritage Discourse is also interesting one to look at, but one we don't need to necessarily just think of World Heritage as the only way to think of heritage. We can think of national list, national nominations. We can also think of heritage in a very local sense as well. And historic urban landscapes for many cities, when we look at heritage as in the urban context, historic urban landscape might be a useful concept, again coming from the World Heritage, where it sort of encourages us to think of our city with having multiple layers, and heritage are reflected in these multiple layers. So, so this is also a very useful concept. So just wanted to mention that World Heritage is not the end of the journey, it's the beginning, but it is a global discourse. But again, we can draw certain ideas from the World Heritage Convention, but I think we can definitely use our own framework, frame it and use it. And I would encourage that, countries like India needs to pay attention to its local level of heritage, community level of heritage, the knowledge systems, the very traditional practices that are already there, and how can these be leveraged to make India's own heritage discourse and the management framework. I would also like to mention, since I mentioned the World Heritage Convention, there is also a very important convention which is called the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. This is a convention from UNESCO which was adopted in 2003, and this gives emphasis to the intangible heritage. Again, we don't need to necessarily separate the tangible and the intangible, but as an instrument, as a tool, this might also be useful to work for India to work in the international domain. For example, India has nominated several of the festivals, cultural elements into this list already. You can also go to the UNESCO website and see this. India is already nominating so many things as representative of India's intangible cultural heritage. So this is something you may want to keep in mind. There's also this another convention, which is called the Convention of Diversity of Cultural Expressions. And this is 2005 convention. And what this does is this reminds us of the diversity, the cultural diversity that the world has. And India probably will find this as very important because India is a very diverse country. And I think that's India's strength. And if that strength is leveraged to not only promote the respect and the sense of moving forward with our cultural identities, I think it will also give a very unique position for India in the global market because of this cultural and creative industry discourse that is coming together. I think India has a huge opportunity here. And just to give one example, one can think of Bollywood as a very successful model, which is a good example of cultural and creative industry. But one can also look at the Indian craft sector and how can one work around it, not just for the tourism interest, but also to look at Indian craft sector as its own economic contributor to the GDP. Right. So this 2005 Convention on Diversity of Cultural Expressions and this discourse of cultural and creative industries, I think, are very relevant to India, which allows India to also, bring in both the World Heritage Convention, Intangible Heritage Convention, and really tap into the rich resources that India has. Okay. And then lately, the Sustainable Development Discourse. And you all know there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And if you look at the history, this actually comes from the Millennium Development Goals, which were then translated into Sustainable Development Goals. Now there is this 2030 agenda, which is actually the mandate. So every country across the world is trying to do several things within this current decade, the decade of 2020 to 2030. And I think if you connect through that, you'll recognize that the heritage idea, the heritage practices, the heritage evidence that India has, you will see that there are a lot of potential of using heritage into all this. To sum up, I think internationally, how the concepts has evolved. It has started from a very material-centric, very history-based idea of heritage. Now it has moved on to the diversity of values, and that leads to the values-based approach. But I think lately, a very important thing is this living heritage approach, which I think is a useful concept for India, where we need to think of heritage as a living thing, but also think of heritage as associated with communities, and therefore it's living heritage. And that allows you to connect heritage idea with the communities. It contributes to the development, community development, social development, sensitive development, sustainable development. So I think this is how the idea has progressed. I think we better take advantage of the latest thinking in this process. And so while in the past, heritage was thought of just as a monument which needs to be protected by putting a fence around it, it has really evolved into really seeing heritage as a vast idea. It has its own problems as well, the challenges as well. And that's what I would like to use the next few slides to highlight some of the challenges in the heritage thinking. And I would like to end here. Obviously, many of our heritage, particularly our practices, social practices, cultural practices, have inherited some gender and social injustice. There are gender gaps, there are social injustices, right? So obviously we don't want to promote those. We want to change those. We want to improve on those aspects. There is also this notion of difficult heritage, because not all the heritage sites, not all the heritage practices are wonderful. They are sometimes problematic, and therefore we need to also recognize some of those problematic areas in our heritage, and then find a way to address them. Not all of them can be, we can get rid of them, and therefore there is a need of interpreting difficult heritage. This difficult heritage notion can be applied to let's say in India, I think that the partition, now you have the partition museum, which is kind of a difficult history you are narrating, So the sites associated with partition, sites associated with the independent movement, the British and all that, some of these might be under difficult heritage. This notion of heritage being anti-development, or the conflict between heritage and development, is another challenge, because I think we don't need to think that way. We can think of heritage being complementary to development. In fact, heritage can be the driver of sustainable development. That's the new slogan that is coming in the SDG discourse. So this is a challenge to change this mindset. I think we need to take that as a challenge and take our responsibility for that. I think in India we also need to think very seriously about something called cultural economics. This is not as developed as the development economics, but if the cultural economics is developed, I think India has a better potential to tap into its heritage resources. So I think this is a challenge to also rethink our economic frameworks. And then globally, this very slow recognition of culture as the driver of sustainable development has been an issue, which is now being addressed. But we still need to keep this in mind, that how can we make sure that heritage is recognized as the driver of sustainable development? And then obviously, earlier I mentioned this dilemma of authorized heritage discourse. These key questions also I mentioned earlier. And then the key thing is, today India having so many World Heritage sites, there is an impression among the communities and particularly the media that only the World Heritage are the superior heritage and all that. I think that notion needs to be challenged. Even if something is not in the World Heritage, it is equally important, it is equally valuable, and therefore this challenge to break the boundary between the hierarchy between the OUV, the outstanding universal value, and the local values, I think we need to go beyond that. And then the other thing is, we need to conceptualize new territories of heritage. And I think India should really pay attention to this, because in every economic turn, India has done a good job by capitalizing on that, like the digital technological development, the space as a new frontier, but also looking at our own traditional livelihoods, our own knowledge systems. So whether it's really the latest technological advancements, or whether it's really looking at our past and looking at our traditions, in both ways, I think India needs to conceptualize its own ways of looking at heritage. I think that's a challenge, but that's a responsibility we must take. And finally, we also need to be careful. As much as we want to connect heritage with tourism, tourism also comes with its own challenges, and therefore the challenges of consuming heritage also needs to be thought of. Of course, it can be dealt with, it can be resolved, but we need to be aware of that challenge. Another challenge is really the need of community participation. Unless community fully participates in heritage practices, it won't be successful. So this is a challenge, but this is also something we need to take up as a responsibility on ourselves, that we need to ensure community participation. And to me, most important as an academic is that we need to see heritage not as a static thing. It's not a thing of the past. It's not a frozen thing. It's a very dynamic thing. It's a living entity, and then there's a living process. So I think this is a mindset that we have to bring in, but there is a big challenge, because majority of people still think heritage is just about monuments. That's not the case, and therefore this conceptual challenge is something we have to accept, and as an academics we have to work on that. So I think with that, my closing remarks would be that heritage is a process of reflecting on our own past, on our own current aspirations, and it's a way to contribute for sustainable development. We need more cross-sectoral engagement like this for research, policymaking, and collaborative practices. So I hope I had to rush. I'm sorry for that, but I hope I am able to give you some food for thought for the next few days that you can think of, and I'm sure the coming sessions will also be touching upon some of these. So with this, I would like to end my talk, and a few minutes if we have, I'm open for any questions. or otherwise I can also come back on a later time if you want to have some question answer. But really, I'm thankful to Mizoram University for this wonderful initiative, and good to be connected. So I think there is some synergy between Ahmedabad University and Mizoram University. We're located in the east and the west, but I think this is a way to bridge this gap and move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for your elaborated talk. You really highlighted the so many topics, so many points related to heritage and heritage of India. Usually we thought, or usually we people think about the heritage are the only point, heritage are the only property which are being recognized or highlighted by the UNESCO and other reputed organizations. But yes, you are as you have highlighted that we should also think about the heritage at national, state level or local level. So it was really very fruitful session. Sir, we are already running lack of time, short of time, but still we have some questions, so would like to ask you with your permission. Sir, one
sure,
question
I
is,
can, yeah, please go ahead.
Sir,
shall I look at the chat box and just respond?
Yes, you can, sir.
Sure. So I think there was a question on the difficult heritage. Yeah, difficult heritage is a concept that some of the scholars use, which I find very useful. And the concept is difficult to explain. So the idea is when you have some heritage which doesn't make you feel very comfortable with that, but you cannot leave it because it's your heritage, right? These are called as difficult heritage. Particularly when you have a war and there is a site, war site. So basically, there was a war that happened, and in the war there is somebody who wins, somebody who loses. So it depends which side of the story you want to tell. And if there are civil conflicts in the society, if there have been those kind of incidents in our history, but there is a site associated with it, right? It's very difficult to narrate those stories because there is a pain, there is a bad part of our history which we don't want to remember, but we have to remember because history cannot be forgotten. So when you have sites like that which you have to interpret, you have to tell to the next generation, you have to write about it, you have to be very careful, which story do you tell. And so these are collectively called as a difficult heritage. So it is about sensitivities, it is about recognizing multiple voices in that side. So that's, in a nutshell, is the difficult heritage. There is a nice book also available if you Google difficult heritage, heritage of pain and shame. That's the title of the book. Urban heritage. When a heritage is in an urban context, it is not just a single monument, but it's a group of monuments. But in an urban context, like a settlement, there are people living around it. So it becomes a very complex thing to look at. Then we tend to call it as an urban heritage. So a city, like for example, the old city of Ahmedabad is in the World Heritage List now. Now that is an urban heritage because you can't just separate one Haveli from there and say this is heritage, or you can't do that. You have to see it in a totality, right? As an urban context. So that is the urban heritage, in which I said the historic urban landscape approach might be a very useful concept. The concepts of conservation, preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, these are kind of technical terms. If you are working on architectural conservation, there are different steps. Like, for example, what John Ruskin would have said, if there is a ruin, you should just preserve the ruin as it is. You should not do anything else, because anything else you do, it will be new addition. So that might lead to a very hardcore just preserving whatever it is. That's the kind of a preservation approach, very hardcore preservation. But when you do, you preserve, but you also might have to change few things here and there. You have to make a structure stable by doing some additional interventions, which is not historic. These sort of come into the conservation. So you can think of a scale: preservation to conservation to restoration to rehabilitation are steps where you are from the one end where you're not adding anything, you're just preserving the way it is, to gradually changing few things, allowing people to adapt to it, and eventually using it for some other purpose. So this is the scheme of things: preservation, conservation, restoration, adaptive rehabilitation, and adaptive reuse. This is the hierarchy. So that's all I will say at this point. I think ASI is the main government department in India you can consider, but there are state level offices also. You can think about that. This is the question. Cultural heritage and intangible heritage. There are different ways one can look at cultural heritage and intangible heritage. In India, if you follow INTACT, the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, it defines natural heritage and cultural heritage as the two broad categories. And within cultural heritage, it has the built heritage, it has the intangible heritage. Some other organizations may want to look at cultural heritage as just the intangible cultural heritage. So it depends how you look at. My sense would be when something is created by nature, you can consider as a natural heritage, and anything that culture has created can be considered as the cultural heritage. And within cultural heritage, you can have built heritage or intangible heritage. So these are classifications. We don't need to necessarily be very rigid about these classifications. These are for our easy understanding. So I think I'm not big fan of these classifications, but we have to understand how we sort of use this in our understanding. I think in the interest of time, I will stop again here because it's 12:45 in India. And I think I took most of the questions anyway. And I think we can, and some of the questions maybe, in the future also some other lecturers may also be picking up. So Dr. Pankaj, I'll stop at this point.
Okay, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Neel Kamal, sir. And first of all, I should apologize due to the inconvenience for our delay of the first technical session. And also being the head of the department of this department of Tourism and Hospitality Management, Mizoram University, I wholeheartedly accept your proposal that in future definitely will do some programs and activities collaboratively with Center of Heritage Management, Ahmedabad University. And it's a nice proposal from Dr. Neel Kamal Champion, sir, and definitely will take advantage of our resourceful persons related to Department of Heritage Management, Ahmedabad University. Thank you so much, sir, for this proposal, and I'm wholeheartedly accepting your proposal, and definitely will work some activities in future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, so dear participants, we have another session right now. So we will have lunch break after this session. Means after the second session, we will have lunch break. So please keep connected.